Just going to move the Christ candles so my jacket doesn't catch on fire. This year, for our Advent series, we are going to be exploring the book of James, and the subtitle of this series is The Relational Gospel for an Age of Isolation. And so, age of isolation, what do we mean by that? Well, last year, loneliness was named as an epidemic in some countries. The United States Surgeon General called it an epidemic and described it as more than just a bad feeling. A Harvard University article picked up on that and continued to describe this feeling of loneliness by saying that it's deeper than something physical. Now, what they mean by this is that, people can have lots of, what these people are noticing, these social scientists or cultural critics, they're noticing that people can have a lot of social connections. They can be surrounded by family, they can be surrounded by friends, and that almost leads to a deeper sense of isolation and loneliness. What does this mean? Maybe you find yourself scrolling through social media and you see your pictures of your friends and you realize they hung out without me. And that moment hits you and you realize, do I really belong? Do I really fit? Do I really have value if they're not willing to even share with me that they hung out? Or you're sitting on the couch beside your spouse and you're watching a TV show and you're sitting right beside them, but you're wondering, we feel worlds apart right now. What's going on? What led to this point? Or maybe you're maybe a little bit older and you go to a family function and you're surrounded by children and grandchildren, but in all of the hubbub that's going on, everything seems to be happening above you, and you just seem to be an outsider just looking in at a situation. And you wonder, what happened? I don't feel connected to my kids or my grandkids anymore. That's what these researchers are talking about. That's the age of isolation. In my own pastoral ministry, I've experienced people who are reaching out for this kind of connection, a connection of belonging, a connection of intimacy, a connection of meaning and purpose, and wondering where to find it. And so the Bible actually speaks into this in a very surprising way. The book of James is found in the New Testament in our Bibles, and it's the only New Testament book that's known as wisdom literature. Now, there are some Old Testament books that we know of, like, for example, the book of Proverbs, that we might be more familiar with as wisdom literature. But the book of James is a book that was written by the brother of Jesus, and it is the only New Testament book that fits into this category as wisdom literature. Now, what is wisdom literature? Wisdom literature is a special type of writing that is God's way of teaching us how to live well and make good choices. How does it do that? How does it teach us to live well and make good choices? By forcing us, by calling us to think about the gospel and live according to it. So wisdom books are God's way of teaching us how to live well and make good choices by thinking about the gospel and living according to it. Now, it's in James, it's the only wisdom literature in the New Testament that God teaches us and provides us resources to help us actually break out of this isolation that we feel. James provides wisdom for breaking out of isolation. Okay, but how? It's because it forces us deeper into a gospel identity. Now, what do I mean by a gospel identity? A gospel identity is something that is outside in. And what that means is that, our being loved and accepted by God is something that is pronounced upon us by God himself through the grace of Jesus Christ that we receive. Now, because this is something that is outside in, this provides us a stable foundation, a stable sense of worth and value. It doesn't depend on your performance or your circumstances or anything. Your identity is something outside in. It's something that you receive, you don't achieve. And so your identity doesn't get shaken by your performance, by how your family or community views you or your friends, or how you even view yourself. But this outside-in reality actually leads to an inside-out renewal. And so a gospel identity is something that's outside in and inside out. Because as we receive God's love and acceptance through Jesus Christ, we receive the way that God teaches us to live according to his good design. And so we live that inside out. It's an inner transformation that comes out of gratitude, not out of requirement. Out of gratitude for God's love and grace in our lives. Now this means, because it's an outside in and inside out thing that changes us, it means that the deeper we embrace a gospel identity, that your belonging is not dependent on your friends including you, but on God, who has already chosen you to be a part of his family. The more that sinks in, the less the scrolling through Instagram is going to shake you to your core and destroy your self-worth. The deeper you embrace a gospel identity, worth is not tied to your role in the family, but being a child of God. And the less we're going to look to our kids and grandkids to provide us something that only God can, our ultimate worth and value. The deeper we embrace a gospel identity, experiencing the unconditional love of God, the more we find ourselves drawn to extend love and care to our spouse that sits beside us on the couch. See, this outside in, inside out changes everything. And this is the wisdom that we need for an age of isolation. And James is the one who is bringing this up for us. And the first way that he talks about this is through the theme of trials. Now, I know that was an extended introduction, but I wanted to paint a picture of why we're approaching James this way. Why is this relational gospel, this gospel that heals our identity with ourselves, heals our identity with others, and with God, how does this lead us out of isolation? It's through wisdom. It's through wisdom. And so, as we walk through this book, we're going to constantly see that James's invitation to us is for us to go deeper into a gospel identity. And the first way is through trials. Now, it's striking, right? He goes right for the heart, almost. This is almost the toughest teaching in the scriptures, and he goes straight for it. Commentators will point out that James is unique, right? If we look at one of Paul's letters or Peter's letters or an epistle of some sort, right? It's filled with, the grace and love of Jesus Christ be with you, a nice greeting, and then they'll give thanksgiving for this community. Not James. He goes right in, right for the jugular. Consider it joy, my friends, when you encounter trials of many kinds. Okay, so we're going to look at three things today: the reality of trials, the goal of trials, and the wisdom for trials. The reality of trials, the goal of trials, and the wisdom of trials. So first we'll look at the reality. The reality of trials is that they are an inevitable test. James is writing a letter to a group of people who are enduring trials of various kinds. And he tells them, consider it pure joy when you face these. Now, what is a trial? The word here can actually be interpreted in two different kinds of ways. The first way is through a suffering or a difficulty or a hardship, an experience that enters your life that is really hard. That's one way of interpreting trials. But the same word can actually be used to describe temptation. So in the Lord's Prayer, this is the best example of this. The Lord's Prayer, lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. That is actually lead us, not literally, if you were to translate the Greek, lead us not into the time of trial. And so this word brings almost two punches with it. It's one side of it is a difficulty or a suffering or a challenge. The other side of it is a temptation or an enticement to sin. Now, what is James talking about here? Well, commentators will say that he's actually talking about both, but with an eye towards the suffering and the difficulty of a life experiences. This is because of the emphasis in the entire book of James on poverty. This is also because of the context in which he's writing. He's writing to Jewish Christians who are experiencing a sort of soft persecution, not a hard persecution where they, that other Christians in the Roman Empire were facing, where they were, being killed for the faith. That wasn't happening yet. Instead, the soft persecution was more of like a social cost. Their economic realities were challenged because of their faith. They couldn't get certain jobs. They were excluded from certain social circles, that kind of thing. And so he's writing to these people who are experiencing this kind of persecution. And this is a trial, okay? And so he says, he casts the net wide on purpose in order for it to encapsulate many different kinds of trials. Now, last year, we moved through a series on the book of Job where we noticed the same sort of theme that James is picking up here. The trials and temptations are inevitable. The Christians that James is writing to are facing them. You face them, I face them, we all face trials. Timothy Keller puts it like this. He says, no matter what precautions we take, no matter how well we have put together a good life, no matter how hard we have worked to be healthy, wealthy, comfortable, with friends and family, and as successful with our career, something will inevitably ruin it. The reality of trials, they will come. But remember, James says trials are a test. And this is really important. When trouble and difficulty and pain, loss, sorrow, temptation, when this comes into our lives, this is actually, James says, it's the testing ground for our faith. Now, C.S. Lewis actually talks about this in The Problem of Pain, where he says that you can have these intellectual beliefs about how the world works. You can work things out in your own head about what you believe. But there comes a point in everybody's life when these intellectual beliefs will actually become a lived reality. There's a time when he says that, you think you're just playing for money in the game of life. He uses a different analogy, but you think you're just playing for money in the game of life, and then it becomes real money in the real game of life. And you wonder, are my beliefs actually true? Is what I think actually right? And that's the test. The test of faith is that trials bring into reality the beliefs that we have, the place where we are. This is so interesting that, when trials and suffering enter into our lives, we ask questions like, why me? Why this? Why now? And this is, frankly, quite a human response. I think it's quite natural for us to wonder this. But it also, we have to recognize that the natural tendency of the human heart, the test that we face in trials, is how we will respond when they come our way. Will we distance ourselves? Like many of us feel like this is what we should do. When we encounter trouble and suffering, it causes us to disconnect from the world, to disconnect from our communities. Nobody understands what I'm going through. Nobody gets the pain I'm walking in. It tempts us to pull us away. But what does James say? James says that we should consider it pure joy. And this is so countercultural because for James, trials represent an invitation to drive ourselves more deeply into a gospel identity. Again, Timothy Keller points out what happens when a trial comes into our life, and he says this: when pain and suffering come upon us, we finally see not only that we are not in control of our lives, but that we never were. We turn to God thinking faith will help us and give us strength to get through, but the process of that, we learn something profoundly unsettling. We don't really trust God for anything more than to give us what we want. This is why James calls it pure joy, because trials, like nothing else in our world, uncover the idols in our lives. What's an idol? An idol is a good thing, a God-given thing, like family or career or sports or friends. But an idol is something, a good thing that we take and we make an ultimate thing, that we rely on for meaning and purpose and satisfaction and happiness. And when trials come in, they actually take away those things. And it leaves us wondering what's left. This is why James calls it pure joy, because it forces us to see and discover where we truly put our identity. Without the sports injury, you would never truly see the role that soccer played in your life. Without the kids leaving the house, you would never really discover the idol that you've made your family into. Without failing that math test, you would never really discover the idol that you've made being smart and capable. And this is why James calls it joy. Not because the trial itself is joy, but because of what it brings about. Because the gospel meets us in our trials by giving to us Jesus Christ, right? This is the first Sunday of Advent. And we are remembering and anticipating the birth of Jesus Christ. What is the gospel based on? It's on Christ becoming us in every way, except he did not sin. He comes down and becomes you, enters into the mess of this world. Hebrews 4:13 tells us that nothing in all creation is hidden from God's sight. Everything is uncovered and laid bare before the eyes of him to whom we must give an account. Meaning, he knows us. He knows what you need. And he promises to only allow trials in order to bring about the opposite of what Satan intends. This is something we learned when we went through Job, right? That God only allows trials to bring about the opposite of what Satan intends. And so what does it then bring about? It's an opportunity to become more dependent on God, not less. To be more joyful and empathetic no matter what life throws at you, not less. To be able to walk alongside others who go through trials because you know what it's like. Consider it joy. Trials are not isolating. Instead, the gospel means that they can be moments of intense relationship and understanding. Because we are forced almost into a relationship with a God who has walked in the same shoes as we have. So, if that's the reality of trial, what's the goal of trial? Now, I got a little carried away in that first point. But the second point is the goal of trials, and this is from verses 2-4. Consider it pure joy, my brothers, when you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work, so that you may be mature and complete, lacking nothing. Now, James raises two goals of trials. The first is perseverance, okay? And the second is maturity and completeness. Perseverance, and then maturity and completeness. Now, the word perseverance actually shows up all over the place in the Bible, and it's a really strong word that's actually a fusion of two Greek words put together. It's the word hupomone. Hupomone. And it's, so hupo, or hyper, that's where we get our word from. Hyper means to be like strong, right? So if you think about being hyperactive, that means you're really active. It's an intensifier. And so it intensifies the other word, mone, and mone is to stand. Hupomone is a word that means to intensely stand. And it's actually a military term that generals or military men would use to scream at their men to stand their ground in the face of the enemy approaching them. Okay? And so an example that I read about is, and I don't know much about this, is the Marvel Universe. There's a moment in the Marvel Universe in Captain America where Captain America gets injured and things are not looking good and his shield is all broken. This is in the end game. And he's like all crumbled up in a mess on the ground and things are not looking good. But then he gets up and he stands. He hupomones. And he stands his ground. He's got perseverance. He's not giving in. He's not throwing in the towel. He's standing his ground, whatever comes at him. That's what this word is getting at. So trials produce perseverance to be able to stand your ground in the face of all these things coming at us in life. Now, the second word is, or the second goal of trials is to create a maturity and a completeness. Now, both of these words, when taken together, create this wholeness. And so maturity is actually a word that is talking about on a trajectory. So if you think about it, as you mature, it takes time for, a wonderful, brew of coffee to come to its full maturity and depth of taste, right? That takes time. In the same way, it takes time for a person to grow in maturity in their faith. Trials, along with perseverance, bring about maturity that ends in what the word complete or wholeness of character. And so we can think of somebody who is growing in the fruit of the Spirit, right? This is what Paul talks about in Galatians is the entire character of a Christian. Love, joy, peace, patience. You're growing in maturity as you persevere through these trials, and you become this more complete person. That's what James is getting at here. That's the image, okay? Now, I know I've thrown at you a lot of information here. And so I just want to try to take a moment and make this as practical as possible for a moment. What is James saying? James is saying, first of all, trials will come into your life. And when they come, we have a choice. We can consider it random or an attack against us, as our world maybe wants us to see it, or we can consider it joy. And if we choose to consider it joy, we are choosing to see that trials are allowed by God in order to bring the opposite of what Satan intends, a depth of our character, a maturity, a perseverance, deeper grounding in a gospel identity. And so what does this look like? Imagine a young artist devastated when her gallery rejects her work, wrestling with feelings of failure. She cuts herself off from her friends because they all think that, she's going to be this awesome and successful artist, and she doesn't know how to tell them that she's failed. She ignores her family because of feelings of shame, of not living up to their expectations, the money that they poured into her education. She feels as though she's let them down. But over time, she leans into the gospel. And she realizes that her true worth is not in her success, but in her identity as God's beloved child, which then frees her, not to rise and fall by which gallery accepts or rejects her work, but to see her art as an act of worship. And through this trial, she emerges a more enduring, hupomone kind of artist, able to face rejection without despair, and more mature, able to see a depth in her work that she wasn't able to see before. Her calling as a child of God to produce art as an act of worship. That's what this is talking about. Now, how do we get the power to actually face these trials in our lives and have the wisdom to respond? James talks about the wisdom for trials in verses 5 and 6. He says, if any of you lack wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you. But when you ask, you must believe and not doubt, because the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea, blown and tossed by the wind. And trials, temptations, troubles, hardships, what James is saying is they're a moment when you will come to the end of yourself. And we will recognize we won't be able to do it alone. And in that instance, when you can't think yourself out of the problem, you're to ask God for wisdom. It's actually quite simple when you think about this. Wisdom, right? Wisdom is how to live well and make good choices. Okay, so asking for wisdom is asking God how to live well and make good choices. And he says, if you ask for it, you will get it. But the human condition is one where we often find ourselves in the position of a doubter. And, we just moved through a series on doubt, and we said that doubt is not necessarily something that is bad in and of itself, but when it stays in the doubt, when you continue just in this cycle of doubt, doubt is something that God uses to drive us deeper into truth and assurance of who he is and how he's called us to live. And so this is what James is picking up here. A commentator, wonderful commentator, Dan Doriani, says, doubters, he picks up on this really well. He says, doubters must be willing to leave their questions behind and trust God with a whole heart. And that's the human condition. We struggle to do that. We refuse to leave our ideas behind, our way of how our life should go behind, the world's wisdom behind, and trust God with a whole heart. Because this requires us to be vulnerable. It forces us to give up control of our lives, to entrust ourselves to God. This is why when trials come, it's all about identity. Who am I? Whose am I? Who do I belong to? Now, on the first Sunday of Advent, we anticipate baby Jesus, who entered the world with vulnerability, entrusting himself to God. He didn't doubt. Jesus never doubted. He asked for wisdom from God. He grew in wisdom and stature, as the Gospels tell us, and he responded exactly how he should in every situation. He passed the test in the desert that we failed and continue to fail. What happened to Jesus, though? See, despite living a perfectly wise and obedient life, Jesus was led to suffering judgment for our brokenness and sin. He faced ridicule, he faced shame, and he faced even death itself. Why? All because he entrusted himself to his Father's will. But that also meant bearing the ultimate cost for our sin. This shows us something profound. Living wisely and faithfully in this world does not mean avoiding suffering. In fact, Jesus' life demonstrates that God's wisdom often works through suffering and not around it. But Jesus bore that ultimate suffering on our behalf. He was forsaken. He was abandoned. He was isolated. His closest followers left him. His God, when he called out to him, did not respond to him. And now that we live on this side of the cross, we can look at Jesus and we can know that because he walked in our shoes, because he faced the isolation that we fear as a result of the trials in our lives, that we will never face that. When we walk through trials and temptations, it will only drive us deeper into a relationship with God. He will always be there for us. Because he wasn't there for Jesus, we can know that he'll always be there for us. This gospel is a relational gospel because it shows us the depth of our brokenness. Right? We can't go through life without God's wisdom. We need it. But it also shows us the depth of his commitment to us, his love and grace for us. And nothing connects you more to the world and to others than the identity that flows out of knowing that even though you are flawed and broken, you are perfectly loved and accepted in him. Trials, testing, difficulty, wouldn't you know it, drives us deeper into a gospel identity. Thanks be to Christ. Let's pray. Father, as we come before you this first Sunday of Advent, we thank you for that vulnerable baby Jesus that you sent so many years ago, and that by his life, death, and resurrection, we could be renewed and restored into a relationship with you, that we could have an identity bestowed on us from outside that leads to an inner transformation and renewal. Lord, may this teaching on trials sink into our hearts, that when we face trials, we would see it not as an attack against us, but that it's joy and opportunity to deepen our dependence on you, and that you, even in the midst of our pain, walk alongside us and give us eternal life beyond this world, the hope of the resurrection, Thank you for this gospel, and may it sink deeper into our hearts today. In Jesus' name, amen.